The 22nd of July 1863, 4 days after Fort Wagner, Morris Island, South Carolina. Sergeant William H. Carney stood outside the paymaster's tent with a bandaged thigh and a decision that would change military history. Around him, 600 men of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry waited in formation under the Carolina sun. They had bled at Fort Wagner. They had proven every skeptic wrong. Now the Union Army wanted to pay them $7 a month. White soldiers standing 50 yards away received 13. The paymaster didn't understand the problem. Black troops should be grateful they were allowed to fight at all. $7 was generous for men who had been considered property 2 years earlier. The War Department's logic was simple. Formerly enslaved men didn't need the same wages as white soldiers. Different duties, different expectations, different worth. But the 54th Massachusetts wasn't composed of men who accepted different worth. Carney had carried the regimental colors up Fort Wagner's parapet while bullets shattered his leg. He had crawled back down that blood-soaked beach, refusing to let the flag touch the ground. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw lay dead in a mass grave with his men because he led them into impossible fire. The regiment had suffered 42% casualties, proving they would fight as hard as any white unit in the Union Army. Now the government wanted to pay them half. The paymaster waited. The men of the 54th stood silent. Around them, white regiments collected their wages and moved toward supply tents. No one in Washington believed the 54th would refuse payment. Families back in Massachusetts needed that money. Soldiers needed boots, rations, basic supplies. Every military analyst agreed that economic pressure would force compliance within weeks. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Sergeant Carney looked at his men and made the choice that would define the next 18 months. No payment until equal payment. The War Department's position was clear and, in their view, entirely reasonable. Black soldiers were different from white soldiers. Most had been enslaved before the war. They lacked military experience. They required special oversight. $7 per month reflected their reduced value to the Union Army. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton believed the 54th Massachusetts would accept these terms within a month. Economic necessity would force compliance. These men had families in Boston, New Bedford, and Springfield who depended on military wages. Soldiers needed boots that didn't fall apart in the Carolina mud. They needed winter coats. They needed ammunition and rations beyond the meager government issue. $7 was better than nothing. Stanton's deputies assured him the protest would collapse by September. September came and went. The 54th refused payment. Massachusetts Governor John Andrew watched the situation with growing fury. He had personally recruited these men. He had promised them equal treatment. He had assured their families that the Union would honor their service. Now the federal government was breaking that promise, and Andrew was receiving letters from wives and mothers asking why their men were serving without wages. In October 1863, Andrew offered a solution. Massachusetts would pay the $6 difference from state funds. The soldiers would receive $13 per month, matching white soldier pay, even if the federal government refused to provide it. The 54th Massachusetts rejected the offer. They weren't fighting for Massachusetts charity. They were fighting for federal recognition of their equal worth as United States soldiers. Accepting state funds would acknowledge that the War Department was correct in valuing them less. Sergeant William Carney, still recovering from his Fort Wagner wounds, stated the regiment's position plainly. They would accept equal federal pay or no pay at all. The Union command was baffled. Military analysts couldn't comprehend the decision. Refusing money violated every assumption about human behavior under economic pressure. The soldiers' families were suffering. Men were going into winter without proper clothing. Yet the 54th held firm month after month, and their protest was spreading. Other black regiments began refusing the $7 payment. The 55th Massachusetts followed the 54th's lead. Units across the Department of the South watched to see if the protest would succeed or collapse. The War Department was facing the possibility of a wage rebellion across thousands of black troops at a critical point in the war. By December 1863, the situation had become a national scandal. Abolitionist newspapers published letters from 54th Massachusetts soldiers explaining their position. Frederick Douglass, who had recruited his own sons into the regiment, used his platform to pressure Congress. The men who had stormed Fort Wagner with 42% casualties were being treated as second-class soldiers while they continued fighting Confederate forces around Charleston. White officers who served with the 54th supported their men's stand. They had watched these soldiers charge into artillery fire at Fort Wagner. They had seen them hold defensive positions at Olustee, Florida, in February 1864, fighting under a battle cry that echoed across the field, "Massachusetts, and $7 a month." The irony was unmistakable. These men were shouting about their unpaid status while advancing under Confederate fire. The War Department's assumptions about economic pressure were proving catastrophically wrong. Union officials had believed formerly enslaved men would be grateful for any wage. They had underestimated the depth of principle driving the 54th's refusal. These soldiers understood they were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the Confederacy on the battlefield and another against discrimination within the Union Army itself. By spring 1864, the protest had lasted 9 months. Families in Massachusetts were surviving on charity and community support. Soldiers were wearing tattered uniforms and broken boots. Yet not a single man of the 54th Massachusetts had accepted the $7 payment. The regiment remained unified in their demand for equality. Governor Andrew intensified his lobbying campaign in Washington. He met with congressmen, wrote letters to Lincoln, and used every political connection to push for equal pay legislation. The Massachusetts legislature passed resolutions supporting the 54th. Newspapers across the North were covering the story. The regiment that had proven black soldiers would fight with courage equal to any white unit was now proving they would endure economic hardship with equal resolve. The Union command faced an impossible position. They needed black soldiers. Recruitment was expanding across occupied Southern territories. But the 54th Massachusetts had established a precedent that threatened the entire discriminatory pay structure. If they won equal wages, every black soldier in the Union Army would demand the same. 18 months after the protest began, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry was still refusing payment. They had outlasted every prediction, survived every pressure, and maintained absolute unity. The War Department's belief that economic necessity would break their resistance had been shattered by something stronger than hunger or hardship. It had been shattered by dignity. Winter arrived in South Carolina with cold rain that turned camp roads into rivers of mud. The men of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry watched white regiments across the encampment receive their monthly wages, while their own pockets remained empty. 12 months had passed since they refused the $7 payment. 12 months without a single cent. Private families in Massachusetts were collapsing under the financial strain. Sarah Carney, wife of Sergeant William Carney, took in laundry to feed their children. Other wives moved back with parents. Some families faced eviction. The men of the 54th received letters describing hardships that military pay was supposed to prevent. Each letter was a test of their resolve. The soldiers themselves were deteriorating. Uniforms that had been crisp and new at Fort Wagner were now patched with scavenged fabric. Boots wore through to bare feet. Men fashioned crude repairs from whatever materials they could find. White soldiers could purchase replacements from sutlers who followed the army. The 54th had no money for such luxuries. In February 1864, the regiment marched to Olustee, Florida, for what would become one of the war's bloodiest engagements. Union forces encountered a larger Confederate army than expected. The battle turned into a disaster. Federal troops broke under Confederate artillery and began retreating in chaos. The 54th Massachusetts was ordered forward to cover the withdrawal. They advanced into Confederate fire, shouting a battle cry that would be remembered for generations: "Massachusetts and $7 a month." The irony was not lost on anyone present. These men were charging Confederate positions while simultaneously protesting their own government's discrimination. They held the line long enough for other Union regiments to escape, then conducted a fighting retreat through 4 miles of hostile territory. The 54th suffered significant casualties at Olustee. They fought with the same courage they had shown at Fort Wagner. They were still being paid $7 less than white soldiers who fought beside them. Corporal James Henry Gooding wrote a letter directly to President Lincoln in September 1863. The letter was published in newspapers across the North. Gooding's words were measured but firm. He pointed out that black soldiers were performing the same duties, facing the same dangers, and dying the same deaths as white soldiers. The difference in pay was indefensible. Lincoln received the letter but took no immediate action. Congress moved slowly on the issue while the 54th continued serving without wages. By spring 1864, the protest had created a crisis within the Union Army. Other black regiments were following the 54th's example. The 55th Massachusetts refused unequal pay. Units across the South Carolina coast joined the boycott. The War Department faced the prospect of thousands of soldiers refusing wages while still fighting battles. The situation was unprecedented in military history. Major James Sturgis traveled from Massachusetts to South Carolina in December 1863, carrying state funds to pay the difference in wages. Governor Andrew had secured legislation to make the soldiers whole from state coffers. Sturgis met with the regiment and explained that Massachusetts would provide the $6 per month the federal government was withholding. Each soldier would receive $13, exactly matching white soldier pay. The regiment held a vote. The decision was unanimous. They refused the state money. Their reasoning was strategic. Accepting Massachusetts funds would legitimize federal discrimination. It would establish that the War Department could pay black soldiers less and let individual states make up the difference. The 54th was fighting for a principle larger than their immediate financial needs. They were establishing that the federal government must recognize their equal worth as United States soldiers. Sturgis returned to Boston empty-handed. Governor Andrew was stunned that soldiers living in poverty would reject desperately needed money. He didn't fully understand what the 54th was doing. They weren't just fighting for their own regiment. They were fighting for every black soldier who would come after them. If they accepted lower federal pay, the precedent would doom all future black troops to the same discrimination. The months stretched into a full year, then 15 months, then 18 months. Soldiers went into their second winter without wages. Families back home survived on charity and community support. The regiment continued combat operations, continued drill, continued every duty required of them. They simply refused to accept unequal payment for that service. White officers serving with the 54th supported their men completely. Colonel Edward Hallowell, who took command after Shaw's death, lobbied Congress relentlessly. He wrote letters to officials, testified before committees, and made the regiment's case to anyone who would listen. Hallowell understood what his men were doing. They were conducting the first major civil rights protest in American military history, and they were doing it while fighting a war. The Union command had no mechanism to deal with soldiers who refused wages while continuing to fight. Traditional military discipline couldn't address the situation. You couldn't court-martial men for refusing money. You couldn't punish them for continuing to serve effectively. The 54th had found a form of protest that was simultaneously legal and devastating to military morale across all black units. By May 1864, Governor Andrew was writing directly to President Lincoln with increasing desperation. The political pressure was mounting. Abolitionist newspapers were covering the story extensively. The soldiers who had become heroes at Fort Wagner were now heroes of a different kind of battle. They were proving that courage wasn't just about charging artillery. It was also about enduring hardship for principle when no one was watching. May 1864, Washington, D.C., the United States Congress. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts stood on the Senate floor with 18 months of correspondence from soldiers who were serving without pay. He had letters from Sergeant Francis Fletcher describing families on the edge of starvation. He had reports from Colonel Edward Hallowell detailing men fighting in rags. He had testimony from Governor John Andrew about communities supporting military families through charity because the federal government refused to pay them equally. Sumner had been pushing equal pay legislation since the fall of 1863. Every attempt had stalled in committee. Southern Democrats opposed it on principle. Conservative Republicans worried about the precedent. Moderate legislators argued the war effort couldn't afford the additional expense. The political obstacles seemed insurmountable, but the 54th Massachusetts Infantry had changed the calculation. Their refusal to accept unequal pay while continuing to fight battles had created a scandal that wouldn't disappear. Newspapers across the North were covering the story. Abolitionist groups were organizing pressure campaigns. Most importantly, other black regiments were following the 54th's example. The War Department now faced thousands of soldiers refusing wages while the Union desperately needed them in the field. Governor Andrew had exhausted every option outside Congress. Massachusetts had offered state funds. The soldiers refused. Private donors had offered money. The soldiers refused. The regiment's position was absolute: equal federal pay or no pay at all. Andrew's letters to Lincoln became increasingly urgent. The president needed these soldiers. The war was far from over, but the soldiers wouldn't accept discrimination no matter how long it took to fix it. Attorney General Edward Bates had been studying the legal foundation for unequal pay. The more he examined it, the less defensible it became. Black soldiers were performing identical duties to white soldiers. They were facing identical dangers. They were dying in identical numbers. The Militia Act of 1862, which authorized lower pay for black troops, had been written before anyone knew whether they would actually fight effectively. Fort Wagner and Olustee had answered that question definitively. In March 1864, Bates issued a legal opinion that would break the deadlock. He determined that soldiers who had been free men before the 19th of April, 1861, were entitled to equal pay under existing law. The opinion was narrow and didn't cover all black soldiers, but it was enough to give Congress a path forward without admitting the original policy had been wrong. Sumner seized the opportunity. He attached equal pay legislation as an amendment to the Army Appropriations Bill. The tactic was brilliant. Congressmen who might vote against a standalone equal pay bill couldn't afford to vote against funding the entire army in the middle of a war. The amendment would pass or fail with the broader appropriations. The debate was fierce. Opponents argued that equal pay would bankrupt the Treasury. They claimed it would encourage more black enlistment than the army could handle. They insisted that men who had been enslaved couldn't possibly be worth the same as men who had grown up free. Every racist assumption that had justified unequal pay for 18 months surfaced during the congressional arguments. Sumner countered with facts. He read letters from white officers who commanded black troops. He cited casualty reports from Fort Wagner, Olustee, and a dozen smaller engagements. He presented documentation of the 54th Massachusetts refusing payment while continuing to serve. He made the case that the soldiers had already proven their worth in the most definitive way possible. They had fought and bled for a nation that refused to pay them fairly. Governor Andrew traveled to Washington personally to lobby congressmen. He met with Lincoln to press the issue. He used every political connection Massachusetts had built over decades. The pressure campaign was relentless. Andrew understood that if the 54th's protest failed, it would devastate black military recruitment and undermine the moral foundation of the Union cause. The legislation came to a vote on the 15th of June, 1864. Section 2 of the Army Appropriations Bill stated that all persons of color mustered into military service would receive the same uniform, clothing, arms, equipment, rations, medical care, pay, and emoluments as other soldiers, effective, retroactive to the 1st of January 1864. Section 4 extended full retroactive pay to soldiers who had been free on the 19th of April 1861. The bill passed. President Lincoln signed it the same day. 18 months after Sergeant William Carney stood outside that paymaster's tent and said no payment until equal payment, Congress had finally agreed. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry had won a victory that extended far beyond their own regiment. The law applied to all 180,000 black soldiers serving in the Union Army. Every man who had followed the 54th's example would receive equal pay going forward. But there was a complication. Not every soldier in the 54th had been free before April 1861. Some had escaped bondage during the war. Under the law as written, they still didn't qualify for full retroactive pay. The 54th had fought for equality for 18 months. They weren't going to accept a partial victory now. Colonel Hallowell, the Quaker commander who had supported his men throughout the protest, found a solution. He assembled the regiment and asked each man to swear an oath. The oath stated they had owed no man unrequited labor on or before the 19th of April 1861. Hallowell, who didn't believe any man could be rightfully enslaved, interpreted this oath as applying to every soldier regardless of their legal status before the war. If Hallowell didn't believe in slavery, then in his view no soldier had owed unrequited labor to anyone. The entire regiment took the oath. The paymaster accepted it. In September 1864, the men of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry received 18 months of back pay at the full rate of $13 per month. They had refused to compromise. They had won completely. September 1864, Morris Island, South Carolina. The paymaster arrived at the 54th Massachusetts Infantry's camp with a strongbox containing 18 months of wages. 554 days after Sergeant William Carney had said no payment until equal payment, the regiment was finally going to be paid at the full rate of $13 per month. Word spread through camp within minutes. Soldiers who had worn the same tattered uniform for over a year assembled in formation. Men who had marched through 2 winters without proper boots stood at attention. Veterans of Fort Wagner, Olustee, and a dozen smaller engagements waited to receive what the Union Army had owed them since July 1863. The paymaster opened his ledger and began calling names. Each soldier stepped forward to receive 18 months of back pay in full. Some men received over $200. Others received slightly less depending on when they had mustered in. Every payment was calculated at $13 per month, the same rate white soldiers had been receiving all along. Private Francis Fletcher collected his wages and walked back to his tent in silence. He would later write to his friend Jacob Safford describing the moment. The letter would not express joy or relief. Fletcher wrote with barely contained fury that it had taken 18 months of protest, political lobbying, and national scandal to receive what should have been his right from the beginning. The money in his hand felt less like payment and more like an admission of guilt. Other soldiers felt differently. Some sent every dollar home to families who had been surviving on charity. Wives who had taken in laundry to feed their children would finally have military wages to rely on. Parents who had supported their soldier sons' families would get some relief. The financial strain that had nearly broken entire communities was finally easing. But the 54th Massachusetts Infantry understood they hadn't just one payment for themselves. The equal pay law Congress passed in June applied to all black soldiers in the Union Army. There were now over 180,000 black troops serving in federal forces. Every one of them would receive equal pay going forward. Every soldier who had been free before April 1861 would receive retroactive pay just like the 54th. The regiments that had followed the 54th's example and refused unequal wages were also receiving their back pay. The 55th Massachusetts collected 18 months of wages. Units across South Carolina and Florida that had joined the protest were finally being paid fairly. The ripple effect of the 54th stand was extending across the entire structure of black military service. Colonel Edward Hallowell watched his men receive their wages with quiet satisfaction. He had supported their protest from the beginning, even when it seemed impossible to win. He had lobbied Congress, written countless letters, and testified before committees. He had found the legal workaround with the Quaker Oath that ensured every soldier in his regiment received full pay regardless of their status before the war. Hallowell understood what his men had accomplished. They had forced the United States government to acknowledge their equal worth as soldiers. The practical impact was immediate. Black regiments could now purchase proper equipment. Soldiers could replace worn boots and tattered uniforms. Families back home could pay rent and buy food without depending on community charity. The economic pressure that the War Department thought would break the protest within weeks had been reversed. Now it was the government scrambling to implement equal pay policies across thousands of troops. But beyond the immediate financial relief, something larger had changed. The 54th Massachusetts had proven that principle could outlast hardship. They had demonstrated that black soldiers would not accept discrimination even when refusing it meant personal suffering. Every soldier in the Union Army, white and black alike, had watched the 54th refuse wages for 18 months while continuing to fight. The lesson was unmistakable. White officers who had dismissed black soldiers as inferior were being proven wrong in multiple ways. First at Fort Wagner, where they proved they would fight with courage equal to any white regiment. Then at Olustee, where they protected Union forces while shouting their protest as a battle cry. Now in the wage protest, where they had outlasted every prediction and won complete victory. The 54th had redefined what the Union Army understood about black military capability. The War Department's assumptions about economic necessity forcing compliance had been shattered. Military analysts who believed no soldier would refuse wages for more than a few weeks had badly miscalculated. The 54th had found a form of protest that was simultaneously legal and devastating to discriminatory policy. They couldn't be court-martialed for refusing money. They couldn't be punished for continuing to serve effectively. They had forced change through sheer determination. News of the payment spread beyond military camps. Newspapers across the North reported that the 54th Massachusetts had finally received their wages. Abolitionist publications celebrated the victory. Frederick Douglass, who had recruited his own sons into the regiment, wrote about the significance of the achievement. The soldiers who had become heroes at Fort Wagner were now heroes of a different struggle. They had won recognition of their equal worth, not just as warriors, but as men deserving equal treatment under law. The paymaster closed his ledger and departed. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry stood in their camp holding 18 months of wages that represented far more than money. They held proof that resistance could succeed. They held validation that their worth as soldiers equaled any white troop. They held the knowledge that 180,000 black soldiers would benefit from the stand they had taken. Sergeant William Carney looked at the payment in his hand and thought about the moment 18 months earlier when he had made the choice to refuse unequal wages. The decision had seemed impossible then. Now it seemed inevitable. The 54th had fought 2 wars simultaneously and won both. October 1864. Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The equal pay victory sent shockwaves through the entire structure of black military service. Within weeks of the 54th Massachusetts receiving their back pay, regiments across the Union Army were collecting equal wages. The 55th Massachusetts, which had followed their sister regiment's protest, received 18 months of retroactive payment. Units in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Virginia that had joined the wage boycott were finally being paid fairly. The impact extended beyond money. Black regiments that had been relegated to garrison duty and manual labor were increasingly assigned combat roles. The 54th had proven twice over that they deserved equal treatment. First, through courage at Fort Wagner and Olustee. Second, through principled resistance that outlasted every prediction. Union commanders who had dismissed black soldiers as inferior were being reassigned or forced to reconsider their assumptions. Recruitment of black troops accelerated dramatically after the equal pay law passed. Men who had hesitated to enlist because of discriminatory wages now joined by the thousands. By the end of 1864, over 180,000 black soldiers were serving in federal forces. The 54th Massachusetts had made that expansion possible. Their 18-month protest had removed the single largest obstacle to black military service. The regiment continued fighting through the final year of the war. They participated in operations around Charleston throughout late 1864 and early 1865. In November 1864, they fought at Honey Hill, South Carolina, where Union forces attempted to cut the Charleston and Savannah Railroad. The battle was a tactical defeat for the Union, but the 54th performed with the same discipline they had shown at Fort Wagner. They covered the Union retreat and prevented Confederate forces from turning the defeat into a complete disaster. In April 1865, the 54th Massachusetts was among the first Union regiments to occupy Charleston after Confederate forces evacuated. The city where they had fought for 2 years, where they had charged Fort Wagner and demanded equal pay, was finally under Union control. The regiment marched through Charleston streets as liberators. Formerly enslaved people who had lived under Confederate occupation for 4 years watched black soldiers in Union Blue Parade, past carrying the same flag Sergeant William Carney had refused to let touch the ground at Fort Wagner. The symbolism was lost on no one. 2 years earlier, the 54th had been offered $7 a month because the War Department believed black soldiers were worth less than white troops. Now they were occupying the cradle of secession with full pay and full recognition of their military capability. Charleston, which had started the war by firing on Fort Sumter, was being held by soldiers who had proven every Confederate assumption about black inferiority catastrophically wrong. When the war ended in May 1865, the 54th Massachusetts had compiled a service record that matched any regiment in the Union Army. They had fought in major engagements at Fort Wagner, Olustee, Honey Hill, and Boykins Mill. They had conducted dozens of smaller operations around Charleston and the South Carolina coast. They had served longer without pay than any unit in American military history. They had forced Congress to change discriminatory policy through sustained protest. They had opened military service to 180,000 black troops who came after them. The regiment mustered out in August 1865 and returned to Massachusetts for the final time. Governor John Andrew, who had recruited them in 1863 and lobbied Congress relentlessly for their equal pay, organized a hero's welcome. On the 2nd of September 1865, the 54th Massachusetts marched through Boston in a victory parade that drew tens of thousands of spectators. The route took them past the State House where Frederick Douglass had helped recruit them, past the homes of families who had survived 18 months without wages while their men served unpaid, past the memorial sites where Colonel Robert Gould Shaw's sacrifice at Fort Wagner was already being commemorated. The city that had sent them to war welcomed them home as proven warriors who had won 2 victories, one against the Confederacy on battlefields across the South, and one against discrimination within their own government. Sergeant William Carney marched with his regiment carrying the scars from Fort Wagner. The wounds in his leg had never fully healed, but he walked the entire parade route. Carney would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions at Fort Wagner, becoming the first African American to earn the nation's highest military decoration. His citation would read that he had seized the colors, carried them to the enemy ramparts, and brought them back despite serious wounds, never allowing the flag to touch the ground. The other veterans of the 18-month protest marched alongside Carney, men who had fought at Olustee shouting "Massachusetts and $7 a month" as their battle cry, soldiers who had refused state funds because they demanded federal recognition, veterans who had proven that principle could outlast hardship and that dignity was worth more than immediate economic relief. As the regiment passed the Boston Common and completed their final march, they were no longer just soldiers returning from war. They were living proof that Black Americans could fight with courage equal to any troops, endure hardship with determination unmatched in military history, and force their government to acknowledge their equal worth as men and citizens. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry was officially disbanded on the 20th of August, 1865. Their service record would influence military policy for generations. The legacy of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry's 18-month wage protest extended far beyond the Civil War. Their refusal to accept discriminatory pay while continuing to serve established a precedent that would influence civil rights movements for over a century. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in 1955, she was following a tradition of principled resistance that the 54th had pioneered 90 years earlier. When athletes protested inequality in the 1,960 seconds, they were using tactics the regiment had demonstrated in 1863. The immediate impact was measurable in numbers. The equal pay law that Congress passed in June 1864 applied to all 180,000 black soldiers serving in the Union Army. Every man who enlisted after that date received $13 per month from the beginning. Every soldier who had been free before April 1861 received retroactive pay. The 54th's protest had changed federal policy, affecting nearly 200,000 troops and their families. But the deeper legacy was psychological. The 54th Massachusetts had proven that Black Americans could fight two battles simultaneously and win both. They had shown courage equal to any white regiment at Fort Wagner. They had demonstrated determination exceeding any protest in military history during their wage boycott. White officers and politicians who had dismissed black capability were forced to reconsider every assumption. The regiment had shattered stereotypes through sustained excellence under impossible conditions. Sergeant William Harvey Carney became a symbol of that excellence. In 1900, 37 years after Fort Wagner, he received the Medal of Honor for refusing to let the regimental colors touch the ground despite severe wounds. Carney was the first African American to earn the nation's highest military decoration. His citation became required reading in discussions of military valor. The man who had led the wage protest in 1863 lived to see his heroism formally recognized and used as proof that black soldiers deserved equal treatment. Many veterans of the 54th went on to political careers during Reconstruction. They had learned leadership under fire at Fort Wagner and Olustee. They had learned strategic resistance during the pay protest. Those skills translated directly into political organizing. Former soldiers became representatives in state legislatures across the South. They helped write constitutions guaranteeing voting rights and education access. They built institutions that survived long after Reconstruction ended. The regiment's story influenced military integration debates for generations. When President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948, supporters cited the 54th Massachusetts as proof that integrated units could perform with excellence. When the first black officers were commissioned at West Point and Annapolis, they studied the 54th's service record. The regiment had established that military capability had nothing to do with race and everything to do with training, leadership, and opportunity. In Boston, the Shaw Memorial was dedicated on the 31st of May 1897, honoring Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and the men of the 54th Massachusetts. The bronze relief by sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens shows Shaw on horseback leading his regiment forward. Behind him marched the soldiers who had refused unequal pay while continuing to fight. The memorial stands across from the Massachusetts State House, where Governor Andrew had recruited them in 1863. It remains one of the most powerful Civil War monuments in America, depicting not just military service but principled resistance to injustice. The 54th's wage protest became a case study in effective civil disobedience. They had found a form of resistance that was simultaneously legal and devastating to discriminatory policy. They couldn't be court-martialed for refusing money. They couldn't be punished for continuing to serve effectively. Future activists studied their tactics and applied similar strategies. The sit-ins of the 1,960 the labor strikes for equal pay, and countless other protests used the same fundamental approach: refuse to cooperate with discrimination while continuing to fulfill your obligations. Educational institutions adopted the 54th story as essential American history. Their service demonstrated that Black Americans had fought for the Union not just as laborers or support troops, but as combat soldiers who changed the course of the war. Their wage protest showed that civil rights victories required sustained sacrifice and strategic thinking. Schools across the nation teach their story as an example of how principle can triumph over immediate economic pressure. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry was disbanded on the 20th of August 1865, but their influence never ended. Every equal pay lawsuit filed by women in the 1,972 built on precedents the 54th established. Every military integration debate referenced their combat record. Every civil rights protest that combined sacrifice with strategic resistance followed their example. They had proven that courage meant more than charging artillery. It also meant standing firm for 18 months while families suffered, accepting no compromise, and forcing a government to acknowledge equal worth. The soldiers who refused $7 a month in 1863 changed how America understood both military service and civil rights. Their legacy endures not just in monuments and history books, but in every movement that demands equality through principled, sustained resistance.